Is Yugoslavia a socialist country? Comment on the third open letter of the Central Committee of the CPSU by the editorial departments of Renmin, Ribao, People's Daily, and Hongqi, Red Flag, September 26, 1963. Is Yugoslavia a socialist country? This is not only a question of ascertaining the nature of the Yugoslav state, but it also involves the question of which road the socialist countries should follow, whether they should follow the road of the October Revolution and carry the socialist revolution through to the end, or follow the road of Yugoslavia and restore capitalism. In addition, it involves the question of how to appraise the Tito clique, whether it is a fraternal party and a force against imperialism, or a renegade from the international communist movement and a lackey of imperialism. On this question, there are fundamental differences of opinion between the leaders of the CPSU, on the one hand, and ourselves and all the other Marxist-Leninists on the other. All Marxist-Leninists hold that Yugoslavia is not a socialist country. The leading clique of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia has betrayed Marxism-Leninism and the Yugoslav people, and consists of renegades from the international communist movement and lackeys of imperialism. The leaders of the CPSU, on the other hand, hold that Yugoslavia is a socialist country and that the League of Communists of Yugoslavia bases itself on Marxism-Leninism and is a fraternal party and a force against imperialism. In its open letter of July 14th, the Central Committee of the CPSU declares that Yugoslavia is a quote-unquote socialist country and that the Tito clique is a quote-unquote fraternal party that, quote, stands at the helm of the ship of state, unquote. Recently, Comrade Khrushchev paid a visit to Yugoslavia, and in a number of speeches he revealed the real standpoint of the leaders of the CPSU still more clearly, and completely discarded the fig leaf with which they have been covering themselves on this question. In Khrushchev's opinion, Yugoslavia is not only a socialist country, but a quote-unquote advanced socialist country. There, one finds not, quote, idle talk about revolution, unquote, but, quote, actual construction of socialism, unquote. And the development of Yugoslavia is, quote, a concrete contribution to the general world revolutionary workers' movement, unquote, which Khrushchev rather envies and wishes to emulate. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev, speech at a mass rally in Velenje, Yugoslavia, August 30th, 1963. In Khrushchev's opinion, the leaders of the CPSU and the Titoites are, quote-unquote, not only class brothers, but, quote-unquote, brothers tied together by the singleness of aims confronting us. The leadership of the CPSU is a, quote-unquote, reliable and faithful ally of the Tito clique. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev's speech at a meeting in a factory of Rakovica, Yugoslavia, August 21st, 1963. Khrushchev believes he has discovered genuine Marxism-Leninism in the Tito clique. The Central Committee of the CPSU was merely pretending when it asserted in its open letter that, quote, differences on a number of fundamental ideological questions still remain between the CPSU and the Yugoslav League of Communists, unquote. Now Khrushchev has told the Tito clique that, quote, we belong to one and the same idea and are guided by the same theory, unquote, and that both stand on the basis of Marxism-Leninism. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev, interview with foreign correspondents at Brioni, Yugoslavia, August 28, 1963, as reported by Tan Yug. Khrushchev has cast a statement of 1960 to the winds. The statement says, the Communist parties have unanimously condemned the Yugoslav variety of international opportunism, a variety of modern revisionist quote-unquote theories in concentrated form. It says, after betraying Marxism-Leninism, which they termed obsolete, the leaders of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia opposed their anti-Leninist revisionist program to the Declaration of 1957. They set the LCY, that's the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, against the international communist movement as a whole. It says, the leaders of the LCY were dependent on so-called aid from United States and other imperialists, and thereby exposed the Yugoslav people to the danger of losing the revolutionary gains achieved through a heroic struggle. It further says, the Yugoslav revisionists carry on subversive work against the socialist camp and the world communist movement. They engage in activities which prejudice the unity of all peace-loving forces and countries. The statement is absolutely clear, and yet the leaders of the CPSU dare to say, quote, in accordance with the 1960 statement, we consider Yugoslavia a socialist country, unquote. How can they say such a thing? Footnote. For the victory of creative Marxism-Leninism against the revision of the course of the world communist movement. Editorial board article in Communist, Moscow, issue 11, 1963. End of footnote. One would like to ask, can a country be socialist when, as the statement says, it is guided by a variety of international opportunism, a variety of modern revisionist theories? Can a country be socialist when, as the statement says, it has betrayed Marxism-Leninism and set itself against the international communist movement as a whole? Can a country be socialist when, as the statement says, it carries on subversive work against the socialist camp and the world communist movement? Can a country be socialist when, as the statement says, it engages in activities which prejudice the unity of all the peace-loving forces and countries? Can a country be socialist when the imperialist countries, headed by the United States, have nurtured it with several billions of US dollars? This is indeed out of the ordinary and unheard of. Apparently, Comrade Togliatti speaks more plainly than Comrade Khrushchev. Togliatti did not mince his words. He said the position taken by the statement of 1960 on the Tito clique was, quote-unquote, wrong. Footnote. Palmiro Togliatti, let us lead the discussion back to its real limits. Leonida, January 10, 1963. Since Khrushchev is bent on reversing the verdict on the Tito clique, he should be more explicit. There is no need to pretend to uphold the statement. Is the statement's verdict on Yugoslavia wrong, and should it be reversed? Togliatti says it is wrong and should be reversed. Khrushchev, in effect, also says it is wrong and should be reversed. We say it is not wrong and must not be reversed. All fraternal parties adhering to Marxism-Leninism and upholding the statement of 1960 likewise say it is not wrong and must not be reversed. In doing so, in the opinion of the leaders of the CPSU, we are clinging to a quote-unquote stereotyped formula and to the quote-unquote jungle laws of the capitalist world, and are quote-unquote excommunicating Yugoslavia from socialism. Footnote. N.S. Khrushchev, report to the session of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, December 1962, and open letter of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to all party organizations, to all communists of the Soviet Union, July 14, 1963. End of footnotes. Furthermore, whoever does not regard Yugoslavia as a socialist country is said to be going contrary to facts and making the mistake of subjectivism. Footnote, Ibid. Whereas, in shutting their eyes to the facts and asserting that Yugoslavia is a socialist country, they are, quote, proceeding from objective laws from the teachings of Marxism-Leninism, unquote, and have drawn conclusions based on, quote, a profound analysis of reality, unquote. Footnote, N.S. Khrushchev, report to the session of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, December 1962. What are the realities in Yugoslavia? What sort of conclusion ought one to draw if one proceeds from objective laws, from the teachings of Marxism-Leninism, and makes a profound analysis of the realities in Yugoslavia? Let us now look into this question. The development of private capital in Yugoslav cities. One of Khrushchev's arguments to affirm that Yugoslavia is a socialist country is that private capital, private enterprise, and capitalists do not exist in Yugoslavia. Is that true? No, it is not. The fact is, private capital and private enterprise exist on a very big scale in Yugoslavia and are developing apace. Judging by the record, in all socialist countries, It is not strange to find different sectors, including a private capitalist sector, existing in the national economy of a socialist country for a considerable period after the proletariat has taken political power. What matters is the kind of policy adopted by the government towards private capitalism, the policy of utilizing, restricting, transforming, and eliminating it, or the policy of laissez-faire and fostering and encouraging it. This is an important criterion for determining whether a country is developing towards socialism or towards capitalism. On this question, the Tito clique is going in the opposite direction from socialism. The social changes Yugoslavia introduced in the early post-war period were in the first place not thoroughgoing. The policy the Tito clique has adopted since its open betrayal is not one of transforming and eliminating private capital and private enterprise, but of fostering and expanding them. Regulations issued by the Tito clique in 1953 stipulate that, quote-unquote, citizens groups have the right to, quote-unquote, found enterprises and, quote-unquote, hire labor. In the same year, it issued a decree stipulating that private individuals have the right to purchase fixed assets from state economic establishments. In 1956, the Tito clique encouraged local administrations to foster private capital by its taxation and other policies. In 1961, the Tito clique decreed that private individuals have the right to purchase foreign exchange. In 1963, the Tito clique embodied the policy of developing private capitalism in its constitution. According to provisions of the constitution, private individuals in Yugoslavia may found enterprises and hire labor. With the Tito clique's help and encouragement, private enterprise and private capital have mushroomed in the cities in Yugoslavia. According to the official Statistical Pocketbook of Yugoslavia, 1963, published in Belgrade, there are over 115,000 privately owned craft establishments in Yugoslavia. But in fact, the owners of many of these private enterprises are not, quote-unquote, craftsmen, but typical private capitalists. The Tito clique admits that, although the law allows private owners to employ a maximum of 5 workers each, there are some who employ 10 or 20 times as many, and even some who employ, quote, 500 to 600 workers, unquote. Footnote: M. Todorovic, The Struggle on Two Fronts, Nasha Stvarnost, March issue 1954. And the annual turnover of some private enterprises is over 100 million dinars. Footnote: Vestnik Usredu, December 27, 1961. Politika disclosed on December 7, 1961, that in many cases the private entrepreneurs are actually, quote, big entrepreneurs, unquote. It says, it is difficult to ascertain how wide the net of these private entrepreneurs spreads and how many workers they have. According to the law, they are entitled to keep 5 workers who are supposed to help them in their work. But to those who know the ins and outs of the matter, these 5 persons are actually contractors who in turn have their own subcontractors. As a rule, these contractors no longer engage in labor but only give orders, make plans and conclude contracts, traveling by car from one enterprise to another. From the profits made by these entrepreneurs, one can see that they are 100% capitalists. Svet reported on December 8, 1961, that, quote, the net income of some private handicraftsmen reaches 1 million dinars per month, unquote. And the Belgrade Veselnije Novosti said on November 20th, 1961, that in Belgrade, quote, last year, 116 owners of private enterprises each received an income of more than 10 million dinars, unquote. Some entrepreneurs, quote, received an income of about 70 million dinars, unquote, in 1 year, which is nearly $100,000 US, according to the official rate of exchange. In Yugoslav cities, not only are there private industrial enterprises, private service establishments, private commerce, private housing estates, and private transport business, there are also usurers who are known as private bankers. These usurers operate openly and even advertise their business in the newspapers. One such advertisement runs as follows, quote, "A loan of 300,000 dinars for 3 months offered, 400,000 dinars to be returned, security necessary," unquote. Footnote, Vesnik u Sredu, December 6, 1961. All these are indisputable facts. We would like to ask those who are bent on reversing the verdict on the Tito clique, unless it is your intention to deceive, how can you assert that Yugoslavia has no private capital, no private enterprise, and no capitalists? Yugoslav countryside swamped by capitalism. Let us now consider the situation in the Yugoslav countryside. Does it no longer have capitalists, as Khrushchev asserts? No, the facts are quite the reverse. The fact that Yugoslavia has been swamped by capitalism is even more striking in the countryside. Marxism-Leninism teaches us that individual economy, petty producer economy, generates capitalism daily and hourly, and that only collectivization can lead agriculture on the path of socialism. Stalin pointed out, Lenin says that so long as individual peasant economy, which engenders capitalists and capitalism, predominates in the country, the danger of a restoration of capitalism will exist. Clearly, so long as this danger exists, there can be no serious talk of victory of socialist construction in our country. Footnote. J.V. Stalin, Grain Procurements and the Prospects for the Development of Agriculture, Works, English edition, Foreign Language Publishing House, Moscow, 1954, Volume 11, page 8. On this question, the Tito clique pursues a line running counter to socialism. In the initial post-war period, a land reform took place in Yugoslavia, and a number of peasants' working cooperatives were organized, but in the main the rich peasant economy was left untouched. In 1951, the Tito clique openly declared its abandonment of the road of agricultural collectivization and began to disband the peasants' working cooperatives. This was a serious step taken by the Tito clique in betraying the socialist cause. Such cooperatives decreased from over 6,900 in 1950 to a little more than 1,200 at the end of 1953 and to 147 in 1960. The Yugoslav countryside is submerged in a sea of individual economy. The Tito clique declares that collectivization has not proved of value in Yugoslavia. It makes the vicious slander that, quote, collectivization is the same as expropriation, unquote, and is a path which, quote, preserves serfdom and poverty in the countryside for the longest possible time, unquote. Footnote. Edward Cardell, Opening Address at the 9th Plenum of the 4th Federal Committee of the Socialist Alliance of the Working People of Yugoslavia, May 5, 1959, and Vladimir Bakari, Speech at the 6th Congress of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. It advocates the ridiculous idea that the development of agriculture should be, quote, based on the free competition of economic forces, unquote. Footnote. Edward Cardell, On Some Problems of Our Policy in the Villages. Communist, Belgrade, Issue 4, 1953. While dissolving many of the peasants' working cooperatives, the Tito clique has promulgated one law and decree after another since 1953 to encourage the development of capitalism in the rural areas, granting freedom to buy, sell and rent land and to hire farmhands, abolishing the planned purchase of agricultural produce and replacing it with free trading in this sphere. Under this policy, the forces of capitalism spread rapidly in the rural areas, and the process of polarization quickened. This has been an important aspect of the Tito clique's work of restoring capitalism. Polarization in the countryside is firstly revealed in the changes occurring in land ownership. Slavko Komar, formerly Yugoslav Secretary for Agriculture and Forestry, admitted that in 1959, poorer peasant households with less than 5 hectares of land each, which constitute 70% of all peasant households, owned only 43% of all privately owned land, whereas well-to-do peasant households with more than 8 hectares of land each, which form only 13% of all peasant households, owned 33% of all privately owned land. Komar also admitted that about 10% of the peasant households bought or sold land every year. Most of the sellers were poorer families. Footnote: Slavko Komar, Some Problems Concerning the Countryside and the Peasant Households, Socialism, No. 5, 1962. The concentration of land is actually much more serious than is apparent from the above data. As revealed in the July 19, 1963 issue of Borba, the organ of the Tito clique, in one district alone there were, quote, thousands of peasant households with far more than the legal maximum of 10 hectares of land, unquote. In Bijeljina commune, quote, it was found that 500 peasant households owned estates of 10 to 30 hectares, unquote. These are not isolated cases. Polarization in the rural areas also manifests itself in the great inequalities in the ownership of draft animals and farm implements. On the 308,000 peasant households in the province of Vojvodina, which is the leading grain-producing area, 55% have no draft animals. Peasant households with less than 2 hectares of land each, which constitute 40.7% of all peasant households, have only 4.4% of all the plows in this region, or an average of 1 plow to 20 households. On the other hand, the rich peasants own more than 1,300 tractors and a great deal of other farm machinery, as well as a large number of plows and animal-drawn carts. Footnote: The Yugoslav journal Index, No. 2, 1962. Polarization likewise manifests itself in the growth of such forms of capitalist exploitation as the hiring of labor. The February 7, 1958 issue of Communist revealed that 52% of the peasant households in Serbia owning more than 8 hectares of land hired laborers in 1956. In 1962, Slavko Komar said that the heads of some peasant households had in recent years, quote, become powerful, unquote, and that, quote, their income is derived not from their own labor, but from unlawful trade, from the processing of both their own products and those of others, from illicit distillation of spirits, from the possession of more than the prescribed maximum of 10 hectares of farmland, which is obtained by purchasing, or more often by leasing land, fictitious partition of land among family members, seizure or concealment of public land, from the acquisition of tractors through speculation, and from the exploitation of poor neighbors by cultivating their land for them. Unquote. Footnote: Slavko Komar, Opus Citato. Borba stated on August 30th, 1962, that, quote, the so-called kind-hearted producer is a leaseholder of land, a hirer of labor, and an experienced merchant. Such people are not producers, but entrepreneurs. Some never touch a hoe all the year round. They hire labor and only supervise the work in the field, and they engage in trading. Unquote. Usurers, too, are very active in the Yugoslav countryside. Interest rates often run to more than 100% per annum. In addition, there are people who, taking advantage of the plight of the unemployed, monopolize the labor market and practice exploitation in the process. Deprived of land and other means of production, large numbers of poverty-stricken peasants can live only by selling their labor power. According to figures given in Politika of August 20th, 1962, about 70% of the 1961 cash income of Yugoslav peasant households with less than 2 hectares of land came from selling their labor power. These peasants are fleeced right and left and lead a miserable life. As facts show, the Yugoslav countryside is dominated by the exploiting class. In arguing that Yugoslavia is a socialist country, the open letter of the Central Committee of the CPSU states that the quote-unquote socialist sector in the rural areas of Yugoslavia has increased from 6 to 15%. Unfortunately, even this pitiable percentage is not socialist. By the socialist sector of 15%, the leaders of the CPSU can only mean such organizations as the quote-unquote agricultural farms and quote-unquote general agricultural cooperatives promoted by the Tito clique. But in fact, the quote-unquote agricultural farms are capitalist farms, and the quote-unquote general agricultural cooperatives are capitalist economic organizations engaged mainly in commerce. They do not affect the private ownership of land. What is more, their main function is to foster the development of the rich peasant economy. Problems of Agriculture in Yugoslavia, a work published in Belgrade, states that, quote, judging by how they are organized today and how they function, unquote, the cooperatives, quote, do not in the least signify a socialist reconstruction of agriculture and of the countryside. They are working not so much for the creation of socialist strongholds as for the development and promotion of capitalist elements. There are cases in which these cooperatives are kulak associations, unquote. The Tito clique has given the quote-unquote general agricultural cooperatives the monopoly right to purchase agricultural products from the peasants. Taking advantage of this special privilege and of uncontrolled fluctuations in prices of farm produce, the so-called cooperatives speculate and through such commercial activities exploit the peasants in a big way. In 1958, Yugoslavia had a poor harvest. The cooperatives and other commercial organs took the opportunity to raise the selling prices of farm produce. The year 1959 brought a better harvest, and the cooperatives broke their contracts with the peasants and reduced their purchases, not even hesitating to let the crops rot in the fields. The quote-unquote general agricultural cooperatives and the quote-unquote agricultural farms hire and exploit a large number of long-term and temporary workers. According to data in the Statistical Yearbook of the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia of 1962, long-term workers hired by the quote-unquote cooperatives alone totaled more than 100,000 in 1961. A large number of temporary workers were also employed. As disclosed by RAD on December 1st, 1962, hired laborers, quote, are very often subject to the crudest exploitation. The working day may be as long as 15 hours, and usually their personal income is extremely low, unquote. It is thus clear that these agricultural organizations of the so-called socialist sector are nothing but capitalist agricultural organizations. Expropriation of poorer peasants and promotion of capitalist farms form the Tito clique's basic policy in the sphere of agriculture. Back in 1955, Tito said, "We do not abandon the idea that the day will come in Yugoslavia when small farms will be combined in one way or another. In America, they have already done so. We must find a solution to this problem." In order to take the capitalist path, in 1959, the Tito clique promulgated the law on the utilization of cultivated land, stipulating that the land of peasants working on their own, who cannot farm it according to requirements, is subject to the, quote, compulsory management, unquote, of the, quote-unquote, general agricultural cooperatives and, quote-unquote, agricultural farms. In effect, this means the expropriation of poorer peasants and forcible annexation of their land to develop capitalist farms. This is the path of capitalist agriculture, pure and simple. In speaking of the transition from small peasant economy to an economy of large-scale farming, Stalin said, "There you have two paths, the capitalist path and the socialist path, the path forward to socialism and the path backward to capitalism. Is there a third path?" Stalin said, quote, "The so-called third path is actually the second path, the path leading back to capitalism. For what does it mean to return to individual farming and to restore the kulaks. It means restoring kulak bondage, restoring the exploitation of the peasantry by the kulaks, and giving the kulaks power. But is it possible to restore the kulaks and at the same time to preserve the Soviet power? No, it is not possible. The restoration of the kulaks is bound to lead to the creation of a kulak power and the liquidation of the Soviet power. Hence, it is bound to lead to the formation of a bourgeois government. And the formation of a bourgeois government is bound to lead, in its turn, to the restoration of the landlords and capitalists, to the restoration of capitalism." Unquote. J.V. Stalin, speech delivered at the first All-Union Congress of Collective Farm Shock Brigaders. Works, English edition, Foreign Languages Publishing House, Moscow, 1955, Volume 13, page 248. The path taken by Yugoslavia in agriculture during the past 10 years and more is precisely the path of restoring capitalism. All these are indisputable facts. We would like to ask those who are bent on reversing the verdict on the Tito clique, unless it is your intention to deceive, how can you assert that there are no capitalists in Yugoslavia? The degeneration of socialist economy owned by the whole people into capitalist economy. The restoration of capitalism in Yugoslavia manifests itself not only in the fact that private capitalism is spreading freely both in the cities and in the countryside, still more important, the quote-unquote public enterprises, which play a decisive role in the Yugoslav economy, have degenerated. The Tito clique's economy of quote-unquote workers' self-government is a state capitalism of a peculiar kind. It is not state capitalism under the conditions of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but state capitalism under conditions in which the Tito clique has turned the dictatorship of the proletariat into the dictatorship of the bureaucrat comprador bourgeoisie. The means of production of the enterprises under quote-unquote workers' self-government do not belong to one or more private capitalists, but to the new type of bureaucrat comprador bourgeoisie of Yugoslavia, which includes the bureaucrats and managers, and which the Tito clique represents. Usurping the name of the state, depending on U.S. imperialism, and disguising itself under the cloak of socialism, this bureaucrat comprador bourgeoisie has robbed the working people of the property originally belonging to them. In reality, quote-unquote workers' self-government is a system of ruthless exploitation under the domination of bureaucrat comprador capital. Since 1950, the Tito clique has issued a series of decrees instituting quote-unquote workers' self-government in all state-owned factories, mines, and other enterprises in communications, transport, trade, agriculture, forestry, and public utilities. The essence of so-called workers' self-government consists of handing over the enterprises to so-called working collectives, with each enterprise operating independently, purchasing its own raw materials, deciding on the variety, output, and prices of its products and marketing them, and determining its own wage scales and the division of part of its profits. Yugoslav decrees further stipulate that economic enterprises have the right to buy, sell, or lease fixed assets. In the enterprises under so-called worker self-government, ownership is described by the Tito clique as, quote, a higher form of socialist ownership, unquote. They assert that only with the so-called worker self-government can one, quote, really build socialism, unquote. This is sheer deception. Theoretically speaking, as anyone with a slight knowledge of Marxism knows, slogans like workers' self-government and, quote, factories to the workers, unquote, have never been Marxist slogans, but slogans advanced by anarchist syndicalists, bourgeois socialists, and old-line opportunists and revisionists. The theory of so-called workers' self-government and factories to the workers runs counter to the fundamental Marxist theory of socialism. It was completely refuted by the classical Marxist writers long ago. As Marx and Engels pointed out in the Communist Manifesto, quote, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state." Unquote. Engels wrote in Anti-Düring, quote, "The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property." Unquote. Having seized political power, the proletariat must concentrate the means of production in the hands of the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is a fundamental principle of socialism. In the early period of Soviet power, following the October Revolution, when some people advocated handing the factories over to the producers so that they could, quote-unquote, organize production directly, Lenin sternly criticized this view, saying that in reality it means opposition to the dictatorship of the proletariat. He acutely pointed out, quote, "Any direct or indirect legalization of the possession of their own production by the workers of individual factories or individual professions, or of their right to weaken or impede the decrease of the state power, is the greatest distortion of the basic principles of Soviet power and the complete renunciation of socialism." Unquote. V.I. Lenin, on the democracy and socialist character of the Soviet power. It is thus clear that so-called workers' self-government has nothing to do with socialism. In fact, the so-called workers' self-government of the Tito clique does not provide self-government on the part of the workers. It is a hoax. The enterprises under so-called workers' self-government are actually in the clutches of the new bureaucrat comprador bourgeoisie represented by the Tito clique. It controls the enterprise's property and personnel and takes away much the greater part of their income. Through the banks, the Tito clique controls the credit of the entire country and the investment funds and liquid capital of all enterprises and supervises their financial affairs. The Tito clique plunders the income of these enterprises by various means, such as the collection of taxes and interests. According to the statistics of the Report on the Work in 1961 by the Federal Executive Council of Yugoslavia, it took away about 3/4 of the enterprise's net income in this way. The Tito clique seizes the fruits of the people's labor, which it appropriates chiefly for meeting the extravagant expenses of this clique of bureaucrats, for maintaining its reactionary role, for strengthening the apparatus which suppresses the working people, and for paying tribute to the imperialists in the form of the servicing of foreign debts. Moreover, the Tito clique controls these enterprises through their managers. The managers are nominally chosen by competition by the enterprises, but are in fact appointed by the Tito clique. They are agents of the bureaucrat comprador bourgeoisie in these enterprises. In the enterprises under so-called worker self-government, the relations between managers and workers are actually relations between employers and employees, between the exploiters and the exploited. As matters stand, the managers can determine the production plans and the direction of development of these enterprises, dispose of the means of production, take the decisions on the distribution of the enterprise's income, hire or fire workers, and overrule the resolutions of the workers' councils or management boards. Abundant information published in the Yugoslav press proves that the workers' council is merely formal, a kind of voting machine, and that all power in the enterprise is in the hands of the manager. The fact that the manager of an enterprise controls its means of production and the distribution of its income enables him to appropriate the fruits of the workers' labor by means of various privileges. The Tito clique itself admits that in these enterprises there is a wide gap between managers and workers, not only in wages but also in bonuses. In some enterprises, the bonuses of the managers and higher staff are 40 times those of workers. Quote, "In certain enterprises, the total amount of the bonus which a group of leaders receives is equal to the wage fund of the entire collective." Unquote. Letter of the Central Committee of the LCY to its organizations and leaderships at all levels, February 17th, 1958. Moreover, the managers of the enterprises use their privileges to make a lot of money by various subterfuges. Bribery, embezzlement, and theft are still bigger sources of income for the managers. The broad masses of the workers live in poverty. There is no guarantee of employment. Large numbers of workers lose their jobs with the closing down of enterprises. According to official statistics, in February 1963, the number of unemployed reached 339,000, or about 10% of the number of the employed. In addition, every year many workers go abroad seeking work. Politika admitted on September 25, 1961, that, quote, there exists a great gap between some workers and office employees. The former look upon the latter as bureaucrats who swallow up their wages, unquote. These facts show that in the Yugoslav enterprises under so-called workers' self-government, a new social group has come into being consisting of the few who appropriate the fruits of labor of the many. It is an important component of the new bureaucrat comprador bourgeoisie in Yugoslavia. By promoting so-called worker self-government, the Tito clique has completely pushed the enterprises, originally owned by the whole people, off the path of socialist economy. The main manifestations of this are the following. First, the abandonment of unified economic planning by the state. Second, the use of profits as the primary incentive in the operation of the enterprises. They may adopt a variety of methods to increase their income and profits. In other words, in the enterprises under so-called worker self-government, the aim of production is not to meet the needs of society, but to seek profits, just as in any capitalist enterprise. Third, the pursuance of the policy of encouraging capitalist free competition. Tito has said to the managers of the enterprises, quote, competition at home will be beneficial to our ordinary people, the consumers, unquote. The Tito clique also openly declares that it allows, quote, competition, the seeking of profits, speculation, and the like, unquote, because, quote, they play a positive role in promoting the initiative of the producers, their collective, the communes, etc., unquote. Vladimir Bakaric, Report to the Fourth Congress of the League of Communists of Croatia, April 7, 1959. Fourth, the use of credit and the bank as important levers to promote capitalist free competition. In granting loans, the Tito regime's credit and banking system invites tenders for investment. Whoever is capable of repaying the loan in the shortest period and paying the highest rate of interest will obtain the loan. In their words, this is, quote, to use competition as the usual method of allocating investment credits, unquote. Augustin Papic, Investment Financing in Yugoslavia, Annals of Collective Economy, Belgrade, April to November, 1959. Fifth, relations among the entrepreneurs are not socialist relations of mutual support and coordination under a unified government plan, but capitalist relations of competition and rivalry in a free market. All this has undermined the very foundation of socialist planned economy. Lenin said, quote, socialism is inconceivable without planned state organization, which subjects tens of millions of people to the strictest observance of a single standard in production and distribution, unquote. V.I. Lenin, Left-Wing Childishness and Petty Bourgeois Mentality. Selected Works, English edition, International Publishers, New York, 1943, Volume 7, page 365. He also said, quote, without all-sided state accounting and control of production and distribution of goods, the power of the toilers, the freedom of the toilers, cannot be maintained, and a return to the yoke of capitalism is inevitable, unquote. V.I. Lenin, The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government, Selected Works, English edition, International Publishers, New York, 1943, Volume 7, page 327. Under the signboard of workers' self-government, all the economic departments and enterprises in Yugoslavia are locked in fierce capitalist competition. It is quite common for enterprises under so-called workers' self-government to engage in embezzlement, speculation and hoarding, to inflate prices, bribe, hide technical secrets, grab technical personnel, and even to attack one another in the press or over the radio in rivalry for markets and profits. The fierce competition among Yugoslav enterprises goes on not only in the home market but also in foreign trade. The Yugoslav press says that it is not unusual for 20 or 30 agents of Yugoslav foreign trade establishments to visit the same market abroad, compete among themselves for business, and take away the other's customers or suppliers. Quote, from selfish motives, unquote, these enterprises engaged in foreign trade seek to, quote, make profits at any cost, unquote, and, quote, is not choosy about their means, unquote. A result of this fierce competition is chaos in the Yugoslav market. Prices vary considerably not only in different cities or regions, but also in different shops in the same place, and even for the same kind of goods from the same producer. In order to maintain high prices, some enterprises do not hesitate to destroy large quantities of farm produce. Another result of this fierce competition is the closing down of large numbers of enterprises in Yugoslavia. According to information provided by the official bulletin of the FPRY, 500 to 600 enterprises closed down annually in recent years. All this shows that the quote-unquote public economy of Yugoslavia is governed not by the laws of socialist planned economy, but by those of capitalist competition and anarchy of production. The Tito clique's enterprises, under so-called workers' self-government, are not socialist but capitalist in nature. We would like to ask those who are bent on reversing the verdict on the Tito clique, unless it is your intention to deceive, how can you describe the state capitalist economy controlled by the bureaucrat comprador bourgeoisie as a socialist economy? A dependency of U.S. imperialism. The process of restoration of capitalism in Yugoslavia is interwoven with the process in which the Tito clique has become subservient towards U.S. imperialism, and Yugoslavia has degenerated into a U.S. imperialist dependency. With its betrayal of Marxism-Leninism, the Tito clique embarked on the shameful course of selling out the sovereignty of the state and living off the alms of U.S. imperialism. According to incomplete statistics, from the conclusion of World War II to January 1963, the United States and other imperialist powers extended to the Tito clique so-called aid, totaling some $5,460 million US dollars, of which more than 60%, or about 3,500 millions, was U.S. so-called aid. The greatest part of this U.S. aid was granted after 1950. The U.S. aid has been the mainstay of Yugoslavia's finances and economy. Official statistics show that in 1961, the loans the Tito clique obtained from the United States and U.S.-controlled international financial organizations totaled $346 million US dollars, or 47.4% of the federal budgetary income of Yugoslavia in that year. With the inclusion of aid from other Western countries, the money received by the Tito clique from Western countries in 1961 totaled $493 million US dollars, or 67.6% of the federal budgetary income in that year. In order to obtain U.S. aid, the Tito clique has concluded a series of traitorous treaties with the United States. The notes exchanged between Yugoslavia and the United States in 1951 concerning the agreement relating to mutual defense assistance stipulated that U.S. government officials have the, quote, freedom without restriction, unquote, to observe and supervise the receipt and distribution in Yugoslavia of U.S. military aid material and has, quote, full access to communication and information facilities, unquote. The agreement also required Yugoslavia to provide the United States with strategic raw materials. The agreement regarding military assistance, signed between Yugoslavia and the United States in 1951, stipulated that Yugoslavia should, quote, make the full contribution to the development and maintenance of the defensive strength of the free world, unquote, and should be ready to provide troops for the United Nations. Under this agreement, the military mission sent by the United States was to directly supervise the training of Yugoslav troops. The Yugoslav-US Economic Cooperation Agreement of 1952 stipulated that Yugoslavia must use US aid for, quote, furthering fundamental individual human rights, freedoms and democratic institutions, unquote, that is, for furthering capitalism. In 1954, Yugoslavia concluded a treaty of alliance, political cooperation and mutual assistance with Greece and Turkey, both members of NATO. The treaty provided for military and diplomatic coordination among the three countries, thus making Yugoslavia a virtual member of the US-controlled military bloc. Since 1954, Yugoslavia has concluded a series of agreements with the United States, selling out its sovereignty. More than 50 such agreements were signed in the period between 1957 and 1962. Because of its conclusion of these treaties and agreements, and because the Tito clique has made Yugoslavia dependent on US imperialism, the United States enjoys the following rights in Yugoslavia. 1. To control its military affairs. 2. To control its foreign affairs. 3. To interfere in its internal affairs. 4. To manipulate and supervise its finance. 5. To control its foreign trade. 6. To plunder its strategic resources. And 7. To collect military and economic intelligence. The independence and sovereignty of Yugoslavia have thus been auctioned off by the Tito clique. In addition to selling out Yugoslavia's sovereign rights in a series of unequal treaties with the United States, the Tito clique, in order to secure US aid, has taken one step after another in domestic and foreign policy to comply with Western monopoly capital's demand to penetrate Yugoslavia. Starting from 1950, the Tito clique abolished the monopoly of foreign trade by the state. The Act on Foreign Trade Activities, promulgated in 1953, permitted enterprises to conduct foreign trade independently and to have direct transactions with Western monopoly capitalist enterprises. In 1961, the Tito regime introduced reforms in the systems of foreign exchange and foreign trade. Their main content was the further relaxation of restrictions on import and export trade. Complete liberalization was effected in the import of major semi-processed materials and certain consumer goods, and restrictions on the import of other commodities were relaxed in varying degrees. Restrictions were removed on the supply of foreign exchange needed for so-called unrestricted imports. Everybody knows that state monopoly of foreign trade is a basic principle of socialism. Lenin said that the industrial proletariat, quote, is absolutely not in a position to recover our industry and to make Russia an industrial country without the protection of industry, which in no way refers to its protection by customs policy, but solely and exclusively refers to its protection by a monopoly of foreign trade, unquote. V.I. Lenin, on the Monopoly of Foreign Trade. Collected Works, Russian edition, SPPL, Moscow, 1950, volume 33, page 420. Stalin said that, quote, the monopoly of foreign trade is one of the unshakable foundations of the platform of the Soviet government, unquote, and that the abolition of the monopoly of foreign trade would mean, quote, abandoning the industrialization of the country, unquote, quote, flooding the USSR with goods from capitalist countries, unquote, and, quote, transforming our country from an independent country into a semi-colonial one, unquote. J.V. Stalin, Interview with the First American Labor Delegation. Works, English edition, Foreign Languages Publishing House, Moscow, 1954, volume 10, pages 115 and 116. To abolish the state monopoly of foreign trade, as the Tito regime has done, is to throw the door wide open to imperialist monopoly capital. What are the economic consequences of the fact that the Tito clique receives large amounts of US aid and keeps Yugoslavia's door wide open to imperialism? First, Yugoslavia has become a market for imperialist dumping. Huge quantities of industrial goods and farm produce from the imperialist countries have flooded the Yugoslav market. In pursuit of profits, the Yugoslav comprador capitalists, who make piles of money by serving foreign monopoly capital, keep on importing commodities even though they can be produced at home and even when stocks are huge. Politika admitted on July 25, 1961, that it, quote, was everywhere evident, unquote, that Yugoslav industry, quote, was suffering blows from the continuous and very complicated competition of foreign industry, unquote. Secondly, Yugoslavia has become an outlet for imperialist investment. Many Yugoslav industrial enterprises have been built up with so-called aid from the United States and other imperialist countries. A great deal of foreign private monopoly capital has penetrated into Yugoslavia. According to Augustin Papic, the general manager of the Yugoslav Investment Bank, in the period between 1952 and 1956, quote, the participation of foreign funds reached 32.5% of the total value of economic investments, unquote. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said on February 5, 1962, that Yugoslavia's source of capital was, quote, largely in the West, unquote. Thirdly, Yugoslavia has become a base from which imperialism extracts raw materials. In accordance with the agreement regarding military assistance, the Tito clique has since 1951 continually supplied the United States with large quantities of strategic raw materials. According to the Statistical Yearbook of the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia of 1961, about half of Yugoslavia's exports of important metals such as magnesium, lead, zinc, and antimony have gone to the United States since 1957. Fourthly, the industrial enterprises of Yugoslavia have become assembly shops for Western monopoly capitalist companies. Many major Yugoslav industries produce under license from Western countries and are dependent on imports of semi-processed materials, parts, spare parts, and semi-manufactured products. The production of these industries is under the control of Western monopoly capital. In fact, many of the industrial products sold as home products in Yugoslavia are assembled from imported ready-made parts and have Yugoslav trademarks attached. Vesnik u Sredu of April 25, 1962, said that, quote, some of our industrial enterprises are becoming a special type of commercial organization which does not produce but assembles, only sticking its own trademark on the products of others, unquote. In these circumstances, Yugoslavia has become an integral part of the world market of Western monopoly capital. In the financial and economic spheres, it is tightly bound to the capitalist world market and has degenerated into a dependency of imperialism, and particularly of U.S. imperialism. When a socialist country sells out its independence and sovereign rights and becomes an imperialist appendage, the restoration of the capitalist system is the inevitable result. The special road of building so-called socialism by relying on U.S. aid, advertised by the Tito clique, is nothing but a road for turning a socialist system into a capitalist system to meet the needs of imperialism, a road of degeneration from an independent country into a semi-colony. Khrushchev insists that this dependence of U.S. imperialism is, quote-unquote, building socialism. This is fantastic. A self-styled socialism, having U.S. aid as its trademark, is a new variety to be added to the bogus brands of socialism, which were criticized by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and this is presumably a great contribution on the part of Tito and Khrushchev in, quote, creatively developing the theory of Marxism-Leninism, unquote.
A counter-revolutionary special detachment of U.S. imperialism. Judging by the counter-revolutionary role played by the Tito clique in international relations and by its revolutionary foreign policy, Yugoslavia is still farther from being a socialist country. In the international era, the Tito clique is a special detachment of U.S. imperialism by sabotaging the world revolution. By setting the example of restoring capitalism in Yugoslavia, the Tito Clique is helping U.S. imperialism to push its policy of, in quote, peaceful evolution, end quote, inside the socialist countries. Under the signboard of socialist country, the Tito Clique is frantically opposing and disrupting the socialist camp and serving as an active agent in the anti-Chinese campaign. Under the cover of non-alignment and active coexistence, the Tito Clique is trying to wreck the national liberation movement in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and in serving U.S. neocolonialism. The Tito Clique spares no effort to profile U.S. imperialism and benumb the people of the world in their struggle against the imperial policies of U.S. of war and aggression. Under the pretext of opposing, in quote, Stalinism, the Tito Clique is peddling revisionist poison everywhere and opposing revolution by people in all countries. The Tito Clique has invariably played the part of a lackey of U.S. imperialism in the major international events of the past 10 years and more. 1. The revolution in Greece. On July 10, 1949, Tito closed the borders between Yugoslavia and Greece against the Greek people's guerrillas. At the same time, he allowed the Greek fascist royalist troops to pass through Yugoslavia territory in order to attack the guerrillas from the rear. In this way, the Tito Clique helped the U.S. British imperialists to strangle the Greek People's Revolution. 2. The Korean War. In a statement issued on September 6, 1950, Edvard Kardelli, who was then Foreign Minister, brazenly slandered the Korean people's just war of resistance to aggression and defend U.S. imperialism. On December 1st, speaking at the UN Security Council, the representative of the Tito Clique attacked China for its, in quote, active interference in the Korean War, end quote. The Tito Clique also voted in the United Nations for the embargo on China and Korea. Number 3. The Vietnamese People War of Liberation. On the eve of the Geneva Convention on Indochina in April 1954, the Tito Clique violently slandered the just struggle of Vietnamese people, asserting that they were being used by Moscow and Peking, in quote, as a card in their post-war policy of Cold War, end quote. Footnote. Borda, April 23rd, 1954. They said of the Vietnamese people's great battle of liberation, Dien Bien Phu, that it was, in quote, not a gesture of goodwill, end quote. Footnote. Borda, May 8th, 1954. Number 4. The supervision against Albania. The Tito Clique had been carrying out supervised activities and armed provocation against socialist Albania for a long time. It has engineered 4 major cases of treason. In 1944, 1948, 1956, and 1960, its armed provocation of the Yugoslav-Albanian border numbered more than 470 from 1948 to 1954. In 1960, the Tito Clique and the Greek reactionaries planned an armed attack on Albania and coordinated with the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. Number 5. The Counter-Revolutionary Rebellion in Hungary. The Tito Clique played a shameful role of an interventional provocateur in the Hungarian Counter-Revolutionary Rebellion in October 1956. After the outbreak of the rebellion, Tito published a letter supporting the counter-revolutionary measures of the traitor Nagy. On November 3rd, the Tito Clique bade Nagy seek asylum in Yugoslavia embassy in Hungary. In a speech on November 11th, Tito characterized the counter-revolutionary rebellion as resistance by, in quote, progressives, end quote, and impudently questioned whether the so-called course of Yugoslavia or the course of Stalinism would win. Number 6. The Middle East events. In 1956, troops were sent by U.S. imperialism to occupy Lebanon and by British imperialism to occupy Jordan. there arose a worldwide wave of protests demanding the immediate withdrawal of U.S. and British troops. At the emergency session of UN General Assembly on the Middle East situation, Koko Pavlic, State Secretary of Foreign Affairs Yugoslavia, said that, in quote, "It is not a question of whether we insist on condemning or approving the actions taken by the United States and Great Britain," end quote. He advocated intervention by the United Nations, an organization which is under the control of U.S. imperialism. Number 7. The event in Taiwan Strait. In the autumn of 1958, the Chinese People's Liberation Army shelled Guam in order to counter the U.S. imperialist provocation in Taiwan Strait and to push the Chiang Kai-shek Gang, which is a U.S. imperialist lackey. The Tito Clique aligned the Chinese just struggle as, in quote, "a danger to the whole world," end quote. Footnote: Slobodny Dom, September 4th, 1954, and, in quote, "harmful to peace," end quote. Footnote: Slovetsky Pavlovich, September 9th, 1958. Number 8. The U-2 incident. In 1960, the United States sent a U-2 spy plane to intrude into the Soviet Union and sabotage the Four-Power Summit conference scheduled to be held in Paris. On May 17th, Tito issued a statement attacking the correct stance then taken by the Soviet government as a creating, in quote, "such a large-scale dispute," end quote. Number 9. The Japanese people patriotic struggle against the U.S. In June 1960, the Japanese people waged a just and patriotic struggle against the United States, which was unprecedented in its scale. But the Tito Clique defended U.S. imperialism, saying that the U.S. occupation of Japan, end quote, promoted the democratization of political life in Japan, end quote. Footnote: Communist Bulgaria, June 2nd, 1960. Subsequently, it attacked the statement of Injiro Asanuma, the last president of the Japanese Social Party, that, in quote, "U.S. imperialism is the common enemy of Japanese and Chinese people," end quote, accusing him of such-called standing for an extremist line, end quote. Footnote: Foreign Political Bulletin, February 1st, 1962. Number 10. The struggle of the Indonesian people. The Tito Clique tried to sabotage the Indonesian people's struggle against imperialism. It engaged in base activities in the effort to prevent the establishment of so-called Nezokam cabinet in Indonesia, that is, a government of national unity comprised of nationalist religious circles and communists. Number 11. The Congo event. In the summer of 1960, when the U.S. imperialism carried out an armed aggression in the Congo under the flag of United Nations, the Tito Clique not only voted for U.S. imperialism in the United Nations, but, in accordance with the desire of U.S. imperialism, sent Air Force personnel to the Congo to take a direct part in bloody suppression of the Congolese people. Number 12. The Lothian question. When U.S. imperialism stepped up its intervention in Laos in January 1961, the Tito Clique spread the view that the United States, in quote, is really considered for the peace and neutralization of Laos, end quote. Footnote: Borda, January 13th, 1961. When U.S. imperialism engineered political assassinations and armed conflict in Laos in May 1963, the Tito Clique attacked the Lebanese patriot forces for, end quote, putting all the blame on the United States, end quote. Footnote: Politika, May 5th, 1963. Number 13. The U.S. Alliance for Progress Program. In August 1961, the United States forced various Latin American countries to sign the Alliance of Progress Program, which was a new U.S. imperialist instrument for the enslavement of Latin American people. This program of aggression was strongly opposed by Latin American people, but was praised by the Tito Clique as so-called, meaning in a large measure the requirement of the Latin American countries. End quote. Footnote. Communist Bulgaria, August 17th, 1961. Number 14. The Sino-Indian border conflict. Ever since the Indian reactionaries created tension on the Sino-Indian border in 1959, the Tito Clique has constantly supported the expansionism, aggression, and provocation of the Indian reactionaries against China. It openly spreads the lie that demarcation of the boundary was already completed at the beginning of the present century and put into the shape of the well-known Mekong line, end quote, and did its best to confuse right and wrong, making the slander that China, end quote, permits itself to revise its border with India willfully and by force, end quote. Footnote. Borda, December 26, 1960. And so-called commit aggression against India. Footnote. Politika, September 3rd, 1959. Number 15. The Cuban Revolution and the Caribbean Crisis. The Tito Clique has made numerous comments attacking Cuba, saying that the Cuban, so-called, believes only in revolution. Footnote. The Rebellion of Cuba, Bulgaria, November 1962. And the Cuban revolutionary is, in quote, not so much a noble as expectation to the road of revolution, end quote. Footnote. Politika, January 1st, 1963. During the Caribbean crisis in the autumn of 1962, the Tito Clique defended U.S. imperialist aggression, saying that the, end quote, the difficulties started when the Cuban Revolution trod on the pet corn of U.S. companies, end quote. Footnote. The Communist Bulgaria, September 13th, 1962. And that, end quote, if it is said that the United States was irritated by the establishment of rocket bases in Cuba, in its close neighbor, that would be understandable, end quote. Footnote. Politika, November 13th, 1962. From all this, people cannot fail to see that for the past 10 years and more, the Tito Clique has desperately opposed the socialist countries, trying to sabotage the national liberation movement, malign the anti-imperialist revolution struggle of the people in all countries, and actively serve imperialism and especially United States imperialism.
Khrushchev has said repeatedly that there is so-called unanimity and so-called accord between the leadership of the CPSU and the Tito Clique in their positions on international problems. Footnote. N.S. Khrushchev, speech at a mass rally in Split, Yugoslavia, August 24th, 1963. Well then, we would like to ask whether or not there is unanimity or accord between your activities and the counter-revolutionary crimes of the Tito Clique. Please answer if you have the courage.
The degradation of the dictatorship of the proletariat into the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. In the final analysis, the fact that capitalism has swamped Yugoslavia in both town and country, the degradation of an economy owned by the whole people into a state capitalist economy, and the decline of Yugoslavia into a dependency of U.S. imperialism are all due to the degradation of the party and state power in Yugoslavia. Fighting heroically against the German and Italian fascist aggressors during World War I, the Communist Party and the people of Yugoslavia overthrew the reactionary rule of imperialism and its lackey in Yugoslavia and established the people's democratic state power under the dictatorship of the proletariat. No long afterwards, the leading group of Yugoslav Communist Party betrayed Marxist-Leninism and embarked on the path of revisionism, bringing about the gradual degradation of the party and state power in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav Communist Party had a glorious tradition of revolutionary struggle. The betrayal of the Tito Clique meant first for all with strong resistance inside the party. To suppress this resistance, the Tito Clique used its power to expel and purge from the party a great number of communist loyalists to Marxism-Leninism. In the period from 1948 to 1952 alone, more than 200,000 party members and half of the original membership of the Yugoslav Communist Party were expelled. Taking action against the so-called Cominform elements, it arrested and slaughtered large numbers of Marxist-Leninist and revolutionary cadres and people. The number of communists and active revolutionaries arrested and imprisoned alone exceeded 30,000. At the same time, the Tito clique opened the door wide to the counter-revolutionary bourgeois elements of all kinds of anti-socialist elements and careerists seeking positions and wealth through their membership cards. In November 1952, the Tito clique declared that the Appalachian Party no longer fits, and changed the name, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, into the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. In violation of the will of all honest communists in Yugoslavia, it changed the character of the Communist Party as the vanguard of the proletariat and made the LCY the virtual instrument for maintaining its dictatorial rule. In the socialist countries, state power is under the leadership of communist political parties. With the degeneration of a communist into a bourgeois political party, state power inevitably degenerates from the dictatorship of the proletariat into the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The state power of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Yugoslavia was the fruit of the protracted and heroic struggle of the Yugoslav people. But as the Tito clique turned red edge, this state power changed its nature. The Tito clique has declared, in quote, the means of revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e., of the socialist state system, became increasingly unnecessary. End quote. Footnote. Edvard Kardel. The New Constitution of Socialist Yugoslavia. Borda. September 29, 1962. But is there no dictatorship in Yugoslavia any longer? Yes, there is. While the dictatorship of the proletariat is indeed no more, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie not only exists, but is a brutal fascist dictatorship at that. The Tito regime has set up many fascist prisoners and concentration camps where tens of thousands of revolutionaries have been tortured to death by every kind of inhumane punishment. At the same time, the Tito regime has pardoned large numbers of counter-revolutionaries and traitors in the anti-fascist war. Replying to a United Press correspondent on July 7, 1951, Tito admitted that 11,000 political prisoners have been pardoned in Yugoslavia. On March 13, 1962, another 150,000 counter-revolutionaries live in exile abroad with pardoning. The dictatorship over these enemies of the people was indeed abolished, and they have obtained so-called democracy. Whatever fine-sounding phrase the Tito clique may use, its so-called democracy is only a democracy for the small number of old and new bourgeois elements. For the working people, it is out-and-out dictatorship. The Tito clique has transformed the revolutionary state machine, which was built to suppress the small minority of exploiters, into a state machinery for the suppression of the proletariat and the broad masses. The degradation of the state power in Yugoslavia occurred not through the overthrow of the general state power by the violence and the establishment of a new state power, but through, in quote, peaceful evolution. In appearance, the same people remain in power, but in essence, these people no longer represent the interest of the workers, peasants, and the working people, but of those of imperialism and the old and new bourgeoisie of Yugoslavia. Utilizing state power and controlling the economic lifeline of the country, the Tito clique exploited the Yugoslav working people to the utmost extent and brought into being a bureaucratic capitalist class. Being dependent on U.S. imperialism, this class is strongly comprador in character and is also a comprador capitalist class. The state power controlled by the Tito clique is that of the dictatorship of the bureaucratic comprador bourgeoisie. The above facts show from various aspects that the policy pursued by the Tito regime is one of restoring and developing capitalism, namely of reducing Yugoslavia into a semi-colonial or a dependency. The degeneration of the state power in Yugoslavia has led to the destruction of socialist economy system and the restoration of a capitalist economy system, when a new bureaucratic comprador bourgeoisie has generally come into being with the reestablishment of capitalist economic system in a new form. It demands the intensification of the bourgeois dictatorship and development of a political system suited to the capitalist economy system, so as to consolidate its ruling position. This is how the process from the degeneration of the party and state power to restoration of capitalism in the entire social and economic system has been realized step by step in Yugoslavia. The process of degeneration has gone on for 15 years. This is the record of how a socialist state, so-called, peacefully evolves into a capitalist state. The Tito clique maintained its rule in Yugoslavia by relying on U.S. imperialist support, the state machine of the dictatorship of the bureaucratic comprador bourgeoisie, the labor aristocracy brought by it, and the rich peasants in the countryside. At the same time, it uses various cunning means to disguise its reactionary features and hook-wink the people. But its reactionary policies are extremely unpopular. The degeneration of the socialist state into a capitalist state, the degeneration of an independent country into semi-colonial or a dependency of imperialism runs counter to the basic interest of Yugoslav people and cannot but be opposed by all honest communists and the overwhelming majority of the people of Yugoslavia. We are in deep sympathy with the people and communists of Yugoslavia in their present predicament. Although the Tito clique can ride roughshod over the people for a time, we are confined that whatever high-handed measure and whatever tricks of deception it may restore to, no ruling group will come to a good end once it is against the people. The Tito clique is of course no exception. The deceived people will gradually wake up in the end. The people and communists of Yugoslavia who have a glorious history will not submit to the regenerated Tito clique forever. The future of Yugoslav people is bright.
The principled stand of the CPC on the question of Yugoslavia. The open letter of the Central Committee of the CPSU asserts that, for a time, quote, the CPC leaders had no doubts as to the nature of the socialist system in Yugoslavia, unquote, and that now the Chinese leaders have, quote, changed their position on the Yugoslavian question so drastically, unquote. True, Yugoslavia was once a socialist state. For a time, the country advanced along the path of socialism, but soon after, owing to the Tito clique's betrayal, the Yugoslav social system began to degenerate step by step. In 1954, when Khrushchev proposed to improve relations with Yugoslavia, we agreed to treat it as a fraternal socialist country for the purpose of winning it back to the path of socialism and watching how the Tito clique would develop. We did not entertain very much hope for the Tito clique even then. In its letter of June 10, 1954, to the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Central Committee of the CPC pointed out that the fact should be taken into account that as the leaders of Yugoslavia had already gone quite far in their dealings with imperialism, they might reject our effort to win it over and refuse to return to the path of socialism. Quote, but even though this should occur, it would not involve any political loss to the camp of peace, democracy and socialism. On the contrary, it would further expose the hypocrisy of the Yugoslav leaders before the people of Yugoslavia and of the world. Unquote. Unfortunately, our words have proved all too true. Indeed, the Tito clique has flatly rejected our effort to win it over and gone farther and farther along the path of revisionism. After it refused to sign the 1957 declaration, the Tito clique put forward its out-and-out revisionist program in 1958 and set this banner of modern revisionism against the 1957 declaration, which is the common program acknowledged by all communist and workers' parties. The process of restoring capitalism in Yugoslavia has been realized step by step, and internationally, the Tito clique is serving more and more energetically as a counter-revolutionary special detachment of U.S. imperialism. In these circumstances, the attitude every Marxist-Leninist party should take towards the Tito clique is no longer the one it should take towards a fraternal party or a fraternal country, nor should it be that of winning the Tito clique over, but it should be one of thoroughly exposing and firmly combating this gang of renegades. The 1960 statement has given its clear conclusion on this point. The open letter of the Central Committee of the CPSU has deliberately evaded the series of important events which occurred after the meeting of the fraternal parties in November 1957, and also the conclusions unanimously reached at the meeting of the fraternal parties in 1960, and tries to defend the erroneous stand of the leadership of the CPSU by quoting a sentence from the editorial on Yugoslavia in Renmin Ribao of September 12, 1957. This is futile. The facts prove that our position with regard to the Tito clique conforms with reality. It is a principled position, and is in accordance with the common agreement of the meeting of the fraternal parties in 1960. On the other hand, the leaders of the CPSU have tried in 1,001 ways to reverse the verdict on the Tito clique, which testifies to their betrayal of Marxism-Leninism, their abandonment of the 1960 statement, and their rendering of assistance to the US imperialists and their lackeys in deceiving the people of Yugoslavia and of the whole world. Has Tito, quote-unquote, removed his errors, or does Khrushchev regard Tito as his teacher? Khrushchev says that the Yugoslav leaders have removed very much of what was considered erroneous, but the Titoites do not admit that they have committed any errors, much less removed them. The Titoites say that they have, quote-unquote, no need to correct any errors, and that, quote, it would just be a waste of time, unquote, and, quote, simply superfluous and ridiculous, unquote, to expect them to do so. Footnote. J.B. Tito, speech at the Belgrade railway station, December 20th, 1962. J.B. Tito, speech at the 7th Congress of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, April 1958. And J.B. Tito, speech at the Belgrade railway station, December 20th, 1962. Let us look at the facts. Have the Titoites changed their revisionist program? No, they have not. Have they accepted the 1957 declaration and the 1960 statement? No, they have not. Have they changed their revisionist domestic and foreign policies? Again, no. The new constitution adopted by the Yugoslav Federal People's Assembly in April 1963 most clearly shows that the Tito clique has not in the least changed its revisionist stand. The Constitution is the legal embodiment of the out-and-out revisionist program of the Tito clique. Edward Cardell said in his report on the draft of the new Constitution that it is the, quote, legal, political, and organizational embodiment, unquote, of the concepts of the program of the LCY. Khrushchev is warmly fraternizing with the Tito clique, not because it has corrected any of its errors, but because he is following in Tito's footsteps. Consider the following facts. 1. Tito denounces Stalin in order to oppose Marxism-Leninism in its very fundamentals. Khrushchev completely negates Stalin for the same purpose. 2. Both Tito and Khrushchev repudiate the fundamental theories of Marxism-Leninism. Both malign as dogmatists the Chinese and other communists who firmly uphold Marxism-Leninism, and both describe their own revision of Marxism-Leninism as a quote-unquote creative development of Marxism-Leninism. 3. Both Tito and Khrushchev laud the chieftains of U.S. imperialism. Tito says that Eisenhower, quote, is a man who persistently defends peace, unquote, and that Kennedy's effort, quote, will be helpful to the improvement of international relations and to the peaceful settlement of pressing world problems, unquote. Footnote. J.B. Tito, talk with a New York Times commentator, February 28, 1958, and J.B. Tito, message of greetings to J.F. Kennedy, Borba, January 21, 1961. Khrushchev says that Eisenhower, quote, has a sincere desire for peace, unquote, and that Kennedy, quote, shows solicitude for the preservation of peace, unquote. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev speech at the session of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, May 1960, and N.S. Khrushchev letter to J.F. Kennedy, October 27, 1962. 4. Both Tito and Khrushchev play up the horrors of nuclear war in order to intimidate the people of the world into abandoning revolutionary struggle. Tito says that once a nuclear war breaks out, it will be the, quote, annihilation of mankind, unquote. Footnote: J.B. Tito, report to the session of the Federal People's Assembly of Yugoslavia, April 19, 1958. Likewise, Khrushchev says that once a nuclear war breaks out, quote, we will destroy our Noah's Ark, the globe, unquote. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev's speech at a meeting of the Austro-Soviet Society, July 2, 1960. 5. Both Tito and Khrushchev preach that a world without weapons, without armed forces, and without wars can be brought into being while imperialism still exists. 6. The Tito clique proclaims that, quote, active peaceful coexistence, unquote, is the cornerstone of Yugoslavia's foreign policy, while Khrushchev declares that peaceful coexistence is the, quote, general line of the foreign policy, unquote, of the Soviet Union. Footnote: Kocha Popovich, report on foreign policy to the session of the Federal People's Assembly of Yugoslavia, Borba, February 27, 1957, and N.S. Khrushchev, report to the 20th Congress of the CPSU, February 1956. 7. Both Tito and Khrushchev proclaim that the possibility of peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism has increased. The Tito clique says that, quote, mankind is irresistibly entering a long way into the era of socialism through different ways, unquote. Footnote: Program of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. Khrushchev says that the road of the October Revolution can be replaced by the so-called parliamentary road. 8. Tito advocates the introduction of, quote-unquote, political and economic integration of the world through so-called peaceful competition. Footnote: J.B. Tito replies to questions by Washington Post correspondent Drew Pearson, Borba, August 12, 1962. Khrushchev also advocates, quote-unquote, all-round cooperation with imperialism through, quote-unquote, peaceful economic competition. 9. The Tito clique sabotages the national liberation movement and national liberation wars in every way. Khrushchev opposes the national liberation movement and national liberation wars on the pretext that, quote, any small so-called local war might spark off the conflagration of a world war, unquote. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev, statement at the press conference in Vienna, July 8, 1960. 10. The Tito clique has renounced the dictatorship of the proletariat. Under the slogan of the so-called state of the whole people, Khrushchev also renounces the dictatorship of the proletariat. 11. The Tito clique denies that the Communist Party should be the vanguard of the working class. Likewise, Khrushchev says that the CPSU, quote, has become a party of the entire people, unquote. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev on the program of the CPSU, delivered at the 22nd Congress of the CPSU, October 1961. 12. The Tito clique, flaunting the so-called non-bloc label, is opposing the socialist camp. Khrushchev also says that, quote, expressions like blocks, etc. are temporary phenomena, unquote. They both want to liquidate the socialist camp. Footnote: N.S. Khrushchev, interview with foreign correspondents at Brioni in Yugoslavia, August 28, 1963. From these facts, one must conclude that both in domestic and foreign policy, Khrushchev really regards Tito as his teacher and is sliding down the path of revisionism hard on Tito's heels. Khrushchev has abandoned Marxism-Leninism, scrapped the 1960 statement, and wallowed in the mire with the renegade Tito clique, in complete violation of the interest of the Soviet Union, the Soviet people, and the people of the whole world. This will not be tolerated by the great Soviet people, the overwhelming majority of the members of the CPSU and cadres at various levels, all of whom have a glorious revolutionary tradition. The great Soviet people and the membership of the CPSU will never agree with Khrushchev's collusion with the Tito clique in opposition to the fraternal parties which uphold Marxism-Leninism. The great Soviet people and the membership of the CPSU will never agree with Khrushchev's collusion with the Tito clique and collaboration with imperialism in opposing Socialist China, Albania, and other fraternal countries, and in disrupting the socialist camp. The great Soviet people and the membership of the CPSU will never agree with Khrushchev's collusion with the Tito clique and collaboration with the reactionaries of all countries in opposition to the people of the world and to revolution. The great Soviet people and the membership of the CPSU will never agree with Khrushchev's efforts to follow the example of the Yugoslav revisionists, change the nature of the party and the state, and pave the way for the restoration of capitalism. Khrushchev has caused dark clouds to overcast the Soviet Union, the first socialist country in the world. But this can only be an interlude in the history of the CPSU and the Soviet Union. People who are deceived and hoodwinked for a time will gradually wake up in the end. History has confirmed, and will continue to confirm, that whoever wants to turn back the Soviet people in their advance is like the grasshopper in the fable which wanted to stop the chariot. He will never succeed in his aim. Brief conclusion. The restoration of capitalism in Yugoslavia provides a new historical lesson to the international communist movement. This lesson shows us that when the working class has seized power, struggle continues between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Struggle for victory continues between the two roads of capitalism and socialism, and there is a danger that capitalism may be restored. Yugoslavia presents a typical example of the restoration of capitalism. It shows us that not only is it possible for a working-class party to fall under the control of a labor aristocracy, degenerate into a bourgeois party and become a flunky of imperialism before it seizes power, but even after it seizes power, it is possible for a working-class party to fall under the control of new bourgeois elements, degenerate into a bourgeois party, and become a flunky of imperialism. The League of Communists of Yugoslavia typifies such degeneration. It shows us that the restoration of capitalism in a socialist country can be achieved not necessarily through a counter-revolutionary coup d'etat or armed imperialist invasion, and that it can also be achieved through the degradation of the leading group in that country. The easiest way to capture a fortress is from within. Yugoslavia provides a typical case in point. It shows us that revisionism is the product of imperialist policy. Old-line revisionism arose as a result of the imperialist policy of buying over and fostering a labor aristocracy. Modern revisionism has arisen in the same way. Sparing no cost, imperialism has now extended the scope of its operations and is buying over leading groups in socialist countries and pursues through them its desired policy of so-called peaceful evolution. U.S. imperialism regards Yugoslavia as the quote-unquote bellwether because it has set an example in this respect. The restoration of capitalism in Yugoslavia will make all Marxist-Leninists see better and enable people to realize more keenly the necessity and urgency of combating modern revisionism. So long as imperialism exists, there is apparently no ground for saying that the danger of the restoration of capitalism in the socialist countries has been eliminated. The leaders of the CPSU proclaim that they have already eliminated the danger of the restoration of capitalism and are building communism. If this were true, it would of course be heartening. But we see that, in fact, they are imitating Yugoslavia in every way and have taken a most dangerous road. This deeply worries and pains us. Out of warm love for the great Soviet Union and the great CPSU, we would like sincerely to appeal to the leaders of the CPSU, comrades and friends, do not follow the Yugoslav road, turn back at once, or it will be too late.